I'm Peter Henderson, and this is a Case Against Celtic Boys Club podcast.
The founder of Celtic Boys Club has been found guilty of sexual offences against 3 boys in the 1980s and 1990s.
What the case comes down to is whether or not Celtic Football Club are responsible in law for the terrible acts of the paedophiles at the heart of Celtic Boys Club.
One by one, he raped them. He raped them systematically.
A child has got no chance of getting away from the child abuser. The fear and the terror is off the scale.
We were all young boys at 14, 15, so nobody was going to really say anything because would they have been believed?
This podcast will not be gratuitous, but it will discuss the sexual abuse of children and its consequences. The biggest thing you can do to support the podcast is to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. The more members of the public that know about this podcast means the more people getting the survivor's message out there. The podcast is free, but it does take a lot of time and effort to make. If you're able to make a small donation to its production, it goes a long way to help. Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the Case Against Celtic Boys Club podcast. I'm in an elevator on my way to one of the top floors in a Glasgow office block that's home to the London Times main newsroom in Scotland. I'm here to meet a journalist that's done much of the recent work on the Celtic Boys Club scandal, Marc Horne. Marc has done a great deal of work exposing some of the lesser known paedophiles in the Celtic Boys Club ring, but these men perpetrated some of this scandal's most awful acts of abuse. Hi Marc, how are you doing?
Good.
Good, I'm glad to be here. So, we've worked together quite a bit.
We have.
On this awful business.
Yeah.
You've written many stories about this, I think it's fair to say.
Yep.
You know, some pretty groundbreaking stuff in terms of the progression of both the criminal and civil cases. So let's just start with one of the big exclusives really that you had in terms of the abuse at Celtic Boys Club. You exposed another Celtic Boys Club paedophile.
Yes.
Lyness Malley.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about him?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was back in 2019. One of his victims, one of the survivors, came forward and wanted to talk about him. And it was, you almost get used to the level of how harrowing these stories are. But this was particularly disquieting. This poor guy who's now in his 60s, when he was aged 11, he said he was relentlessly abused by Malley. He said he used the excuse of rubbing oil on him to abuse him. He said this has had a profound effect on him, on his life. He said at the age of 12, he would lie in bed at night and pull his hair out from his crown because he didn't want to fall asleep because he knew he would dream and relive all these nightmares that he'd gone through. It was that bad that he said he contemplated taking his own life. And he said he'd got to a point where he wasn't going to keep quiet anymore. He wanted to speak about this guy. He wanted to name him. And yeah, I went on the case.
It's interesting because it was a bit of a mystery.
Yes.
The survivor that you talk about who we went and met together,
yes,
he remembered him as a coach called Malley. He couldn't remember his surname.
Yeah. But
he was able to identify his abuser from a series of pictures,
yes,
and that person was
Lyness
Malley.
Yeah.
So the mysterious coach Malley was actually Malley, wasn't he?
That's right, yeah, it's Malley. And Malley had been with Celtic Boys Club for a long time. He served as a coach. He was there as a minutes secretary. He was there also as a treasurer. He was there for a long time and played a variety of roles within the Boys Club.
And he seemed to be particularly close to another convicted Celtic Boys Club paedophile, wasn't he?
It turned out he was particularly close to Jim Torbett.
So you went to meet the victim, Malley's victim, and we went together to meet him because I'd met him previously. A brave man.
an extremely brave man, a very articulate man, a very courageous man. But it was, harrowing to listen to what he had gone through. But it made me want to take up his case, want to confront this guy, want to get justice for him, for what had happened to him.
So let's be clear. Lyness Malley was questioned by the police, but he was never charged.
That's right.
He's now dead.
Yep.
He died a year or so ago. Did that prove difficult in terms of being able to write a story about it? I mean, I had no doubt whatsoever that the survivor was telling the truth, as did you. You actually managed to track Malley down. Can you explain how that happened?
Yeah, our lawyers said, look, this is a very difficult one. You need to give this guy the right of reply. So I found an address for him, and went out one morning. And so I found out he lived directly opposite Govan High School. He was beside the school gate. And it was very weird when I went up to his house. He was a guy who lived alone, and yet he had children's toys in his windows, which I thought was a bit weird and creepy. I knocked at the door, took a deep breath, all ready to confront him. Nothing. Nobody answered the door. So I thought, right, I'll give it a bit of time. I walked around the block, I came back, and I thought, he's not going to be in. So I wrote a note saying, look, give me a call when you get this. So I knocked at the door half-heartedly, and eventually it creaks open. It's a wizened old guy there, and said, what do you want?
We're going to take a break just for a moment. We'll be back shortly. Welcome back. Remember, the best way that you can support this podcast is to subscribe, write a review, or if possible, make a small donation via our Patreon site. The link is in the show notes. Now, let's get back and hear more from Marc Horne at the Times.
So I explained the situation to him. I said, these most serious of allegations have been made against you when you were involved with Celtic Boys Club. Let's hear what you've got to say about this.
So did he invite you inside?
He didn't. He kept me at arm's length. He kept me on the doorstep. He was quite frosty. So I put all the allegations to him, and I told him the damage that it's done to the life of the survivor, and it still hurts him and it damages him to this day. He's got anxiety and depression, and I put it to him that it was caused by him. And he said, no, it couldn't have been him. He wasn't that type of person. He said that part of his role was to rub the boys with oil. He said that he did that. This was part of his duties, but there was nothing sinister about that. He would just rub them up and down with oil, and that was just that was part of their training and part of their recovery. But there was nothing sinister about that. That was his story. He said he wasn't that sort of person, and he said that he had no memory of this individual, but he said perhaps he'd said to him, son, you're just not good enough. And he said that this was a vindictive individual who was out for revenge. That was the only excuse he could give.
It's curious, isn't it? Because almost word for word, these are things that another convicted Celtic paedophile, Frank Kearney, has said. The kids are out to get him.
Yep.
They've been nursing some grudge for 40 years.
That's it.
And he would also rub children with oil as a means of facilitating sexual abuse.
Yes.
Malley denied everything.
He denied everything, yeah. Said he was an innocent guy. He compared himself to Cliff Richard. He said, we're both two decent guys who've been wrongly accused. The disgrace, he said. Innocent guy like him being hounded. It just wasn't fair, he said.
You were able to run the story.
Yeah.
How did you feel about that? And do you know how the survivor felt about it?
Yeah, I was very pleased that we managed to get the story out there and that we managed to name him. It took a long while, a lot of negotiations with our lawyers, but they were keen to find a way through, and they felt that we'd given him every opportunity to put his side of the story across, and they felt that we were able to put a fair and balanced article. But having him named and out there, I think, the survivor was very pleased. He said he'd been waiting decades for that to happen, to see him named and photographed in the press. And a number of other newspapers and outlets followed up on it as well. So yeah, it got a lot of publicity.
Tracking down and exposing of paedophiles is something that you're particularly good at. Another convicted paedophile, with links to Celtic and with links to other convicted Celtic Boys Club paedophiles, Bill Kelly. Can you talk to me about Bill Kelly, who he was, where he lived, and how he connects with Celtic Boys Club?
Yeah, Bill Kelly was a guy who by day he was a janitor at a police station, but in his spare time he was Mr. Youth Football in West Lothian from the 60s up until the 80s. He was the manager of Uphall Saints, which was a very successful team in West Lothian. It went on to produce a number of professional players, won a number of tournaments around the UK and overseas. And at the end of seasons, they were often had visitors from Celtic FC who went on to say, you know, we're really glad to have ties with you guys and we will support you in everything you're doing. They described them as a prolific feeder club. And yeah, Bill Kelly was the guy who facilitated this.
So, Bill Kelly is also a convicted paedophile.
Yes.
How did his child abuse manifest itself? He was preying on players in his youth team.
He was, yeah. So in 1987, he was convicted of abusing no fewer than 12 players in his clubs over a 22-year period. But he was only jailed for 1 year, and that was because the judge at the time said it had no negative impact on the lives of the young players involved, which is a frankly outrageous thing to say.
It's just unfathomable.
Yeah, it's completely unfathomable. But yeah, there was other people came forward to speak to me. There was one courageous, remarkable guy called Malcolm Rogers. He came forward. Now, he went on to serve with the British Army in Bosnia. He then went on to coach the Newcastle Falcons rugby team. But when he was younger, he got involved with Uphall Saints and Bill Kelly. And this was in the early 1980s. And he said, look, son, you're good. Stick with me and you're going to make it. And he introduced him to another coach who was a guy called Jim McCafferty, who he recognised as then was the manager of the neighbouring team, Fauldhouse United. He went on to become a kit man with Celtic and was also involved with the boys' club at Celtic. Malcolm says that Bill Kelly introduced him to Jim, and that from that moment onwards they abused him together on a number of occasions, which is just horrific. Think about it.
Yeah, so McCafferty, just so we can re-emphasise, was convicted of abusing multiple children, and recently died in prison.
Yes, that's right.
And he was connected with Bill Kelly.
Yes.
What do we know about McCafferty and Kelly's links with other convicted paedophiles?
So, yeah, Malcolm says that on one occasion he was taken down to Blackpool to play in a tournament, and this would be good for his career. And McCafferty and Bill Kelly were there, and they said that there's a guy they want you to meet. He's a scout with crew, and he's going to be really good for your career if you meet this guy, so you might want to be grateful. And the man that they introduced him to was Barry Bennell, who's one of the most prolific sex offenders this country's ever known.
Who's currently serving, I think, a 25-year sentence in England.
When he was convicted, the judge said that he'd abused young footballers on an industrial scale. That was the phrase that he used.
So we have a situation here where Bill Kelly, convicted paedophile, is friends with Jim McCafferty, convicted paedophile. Both men went on or did have very strong links with Celtic Boys Club. And both men knew and abused children together with Barry Bennell.
One of the most notorious paedophiles in sporting history.
How did you feel when you discovered this?
My head was just spinning. The whole extent of it is extraordinary. And I believe what Malcolm told me, and he's damaged by it to this day, but I believe he was telling the truth.
So you were able to interview Bill Kelly, is that correct?
I did.
Can you explain how that came about and your impressions about how he was living his life?
He was living in a retirement home in West Lothian. We managed to track down an address for him. So I went there with a photographer one day, and I knocked on his door, and then I saw the curtain opening, and I saw his wizened old face peeking through. He looked at me, and they just closed the curtains. And he wouldn't come out, he wouldn't speak to me. So we hung around. He was in his kitchen having a cup of tea. I knocked on the window, and then he opened the window and said, "What do you want?" And I said, "Well, look, I hear you've been abusing boys." And he says, "Look, this was many, 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 many moons ago. I don't want to go back into that." So I explained what had happened to Malcolm and others, the pain they'd gone through. And I said, "Look, they've told me in graphic detail what you did to them. What have you got to say to these guys? What have you got to say to these guys whose lives you ruined? What have you got to say?" He says, "I'm saying nothing." He says, "That was a long time ago, a long time ago." So, I put it to him that he knew other paedophiles. I put it to him that he worked with McCafferty and Bennell. He denied this. He said he didn't know them. But we know for a fact that he definitely did know Jim McCafferty because they were managers for neighbouring teams. They definitely did know each other. So he was lying there.
And although, McCafferty was heavily involved with Celtic Boys Club and was also employed by Celtic, the senior club, as a kit man, have you any doubt at all in your mind that the paedophile, rampant child abuse, paedophilia linked to Celtic Boys Club stretched out further to these small youth teams in central Scotland?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's interesting. There was another survivor came forward with a particularly harrowing account. Now, this was in the late 60s, early 70s. He said that he and his teammates would be taken to Bill Kelly's house. He'd say, "Let's prepare for the game." He'd put them in a bath, and then one by one, the expression he said was he would pick us off, take us up to his bedroom, and he raped them. He raped them systematically. He also said, which I found particularly interesting, that he and other boys were taken to a health centre which no longer exists. It was called the Olympic Health Centre. It used to be in Lothian Road in Edinburgh. And he would say on a Saturday morning, he and other boys would be taken by Bill Kelly there and paraded in front of his friends. And he said that among his friends, he recognised a referee who was involved in youth football. And he also recognised another scout. And he believes that was Harry Dunn, who was a scout who was heavily involved in the Edinburgh youth football scene, who later went on to scout for Rangers, Liverpool and Chelsea. Now, he died in 2017 before he could face charges, sexual abuse charges that were made against him. But he was adamant that he recognised him, that he was there with Bill Kelly and his like-minded friends. He said that this leisure centre was nowhere near where he lived in West Lothian, but he says he now could understand why he would take him so far out of the way. He didn't drive, but he would take him on a bus, other little boys, take them there to this leisure centre, and his story was that, he was there with like-minded individuals. It's horrifying.
It's a paedophile ring.
Yeah.
A paedophile ring, at the heart of Scottish youth football.
Yeah.
And all of these men with links to the Celtic Boys Club.
Yeah.
So, at this time, you began working with another very well-known journalist.
Yep.
I think probably one of the most accomplished journalists in Europe, you could say, Alex Thompson from Channel 4 News. Can you explain how that came about?
Yeah, Alex had been reading some of the stories and following the progress of it, and he was very keen to become involved. He thought this was a much bigger story, and he thought it deserved a wider airing. So he came up and investigated the story.
And both of you worked on it together. How did you find that, collaborating with another journalist who's, not a newspaper journalist, a broadcast journalist?
Yeah, I was really grateful for his involvement, because sometimes it felt like it was, kind of on my own in this. So it was good to have somebody else come in and say, "Look, you're right. This is a story. This is a massive story. This needs to be brought to a wider audience." And it was great to work with Alex on that. He did a great job on it.
In terms of how the story's been covered, I mean, obviously, it was covered back in the 90s when it was initially, it was investigated in the 80s and shut down because of the power of the club. It was exposed again in the 90s with a lot of good journalists exposing it, leading to the first conviction of Celtic Boys Club founder Torbett, leading to his first conviction. It was then covered again by some really, really good journalists at the BBC who again exposed Torbett, which new survivors, new victims of Torbett, which led to Torbett's second conviction. So there have been really, really good journalists all through working on this. But never really any attention outside Scotland. Does it frustrate you sometimes that this has not been covered more widely than, let's say, if this had happened at Liverpool or Chelsea?
Yeah, I mean, it's hugely frustrating on the basis that, I mean, it's been described as the biggest sexual abuse scandal in UK football, and it might even be Europe-wide or worldwide. So you've got to a situation where you've got 4 senior individuals who are involved with the Boys Club have been convicted of serious crimes against players. And you've also got 2 other individuals, one employed by Celtic and another employed by a Celtic feeder club that was based in Edinburgh, who've also been convicted of offences against young players. It's a big story. There's no way around it.
Yeah, and you know, I often, you know, see comments, you know, on various football forums about why isn't this covered more?
Yeah.
Well, I think certainly in the work that I've done with the lawyers, I've been called about this more than any other case that the law firm are involved in. Very few phone calls from England. In fact, I try to go out of my way to make a point of drawing people in England's attention to this. I've also been told, basically point blank, that we're not interested because it's in Scotland.
Yes.
Which I find very frustrating and upsetting, actually. I mean, what's the explanation for it, do you think?
I think it's a kind of London-centric approach that unless it's, you know, happening in England, then it doesn't really count. It has to be so much more serious to be heard if it's in Scotland. These are seen as, you know, provincial stories, and, you know, the local outlets can cover them.
I completely agree with that. And when I was a working journalist, certainly that was the case, that something had to be of momentous seriousness for it, for newspapers or broadcasters in London to even show the slightest interest.
It would have to be of momentous seriousness or be something kind of whimsical and stereotypical. You know, if it was a story about the Loch Ness Monster or the Queen Mother or something, whiskey and haggis, that's fine. But when you're talking about a huge sporting scandal like this, you know, it's a bit Scottish.
Okay. In terms of your overall impressions of your journalistic career, you know, where does this story lie in terms of the size of stories you worked on, and, you know, the seriousness of it, the amount of investigation that has been required from you?
Yeah, I think without doubt it's one of the most significant stories of my career, and it's required a lot of work. And that's quite right, because the people who are involved, the survivors, they deserve to have their stories listened to. They deserve to have, you know, the truth for finally to come out and be told. But I mean, it's a wider story. The story of abuse within football is a massive thing. I've not just been concentrating on Celtic. I've looked at abuse within Rangers, within Partick Thistle, within other clubs. But Celtic stands out because it's far and away a place that has been harbouring the most paedophiles. And it's difficult sometimes, because when you listen to people and you're really relieved they've come forward and are speaking out, but it has an impact on you. Once you hear what happened to them, you can't unhear it. It stays with you. So when I'm not working, when I was spending a time investigating this and nothing else, I would go home at weekends and my head would be full of nothing else but this. I couldn't stop thinking about it. My wife was like, you need to take a break from this. This is too much.
My wife has said exactly the same thing to me on many occasions. On many occasions.
But it gets under your skin when you think about the injustice that's been perpetrated. You want to put a stop to it.
Yeah, it's the most monstrous injustice, isn't it? And I mean, what observations would you be prepared to make about the conduct of Glasgow Celtic, the big club, the main club, in terms of what it claims is its relationship with Celtic Boys Club?
Yeah, we wrote an editorial, and we said that, you know, Celtic isn't just a football club; it's a massive institution in Scotland and throughout the world. But it proclaims that it's a special football club because of its belief in social justice. It was founded to feed hungry immigrants. So it should be held to a higher standard, I think. And yet it's fallen on that hurdle really badly, because it's a struggle to get any comment at all from the club. They put out a fairly bland statement. Then they said they were holding their own investigation, which still no evidence from that has ever emerged. And that was years ago. And then for a long while, every time I would write an article, I'd put the allegations to Celtic and say, would you like to comment? And they just stopped responding. I got no response whatsoever.
We have approached Celtic Football Club to ask them for a comment. We've received no reply. We'll be hearing more from Marc Horne at the Times in a future episode, but for now, we're going to move on. There'll be a preview of episode 5 just in a moment, but remember, to help support the podcast, please subscribe, or if possible, leave a small donation via our Patreon site. The podcast is free, but any small donation helps. Now, coming up in episode 5.
Jim Torbett had controlled my life in many, many ways for 50 years. And this was the culmination of my campaign for justice. I was in the High Court. He was there to answer my allegations. I did not want Torbett to think for one more second that he had any power over me.